If you'll be finding your seats, we'll begin in just a second. Thank you so much for being here. I've been in Texas for a while with some of you. I feel like I've been away for longer than I really have. And thanks so much for being here. Our study tonight is going to cover 2 chapters. It'll be a little different from the speed at which we've been studying in the past, of covering about 4 to 5 chapters each time. And after this class, we'll jump right into 2 Samuel, and you're going to see how seamless the transition from 1 to 2 Samuel is, and that's because what I'd suggest to you is why it was originally one book. I don't know, I didn't study all the reasoning behind why they transitioned to cutting it apart. But here we're going to get to the 31st chapter tonight, and then we'll begin next Wednesday with chapter 1 and conclude at the end at chapter 24. Okay? So let's begin with a prayer together. Make sure I'm all silenced here. Our great God in heaven, we thank you so much again for today, that we again can be able to wake up to your day that you've made for us, to see that you've sustained everything from the day before, as you have every day since the beginning of time. We thank you so much for your consistent character, your consistent care of this world, for the people in it, as well as your care for those who would endure the struggle of living in this life. Enduring the evil, enduring the corruption, the evil intent and motivations that are malicious. We pray, Father, that as we continue to pursue the things that are earthly in us to destroy them, that we do so with fervor and with great vengeance and aggravation, because this is not who we want to be. We want to be pure in your sight. We want to be whole. We want to be what we're missing. We want to be ultimately, Father, in your presence, to be able to bask in your glorious light as we were able to see the sun even today. We thank you so much for these physical things that we have that bear witness to your great magnitude of power, great care and grace and mercy, that even the things that we see as the rain has fallen on us this weekend and even today in parts of our state, that your rain falls upon the just and the unjust, and that it is not something that is always apparent to us, that we may be misjudging ourselves. Please, Father, as we study tonight, help us to self-reflect, self-examine, and point the finger directly at ourselves so that we can be better for one another, so we can be better for ourselves, so that we can draw others to you, so that others can see clearly what it looks like to follow Christ. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So if you're just joining us, we're in the last 2 chapters of 1 Samuel, 30 and 31. They're not long chapters. We're going to look at both of them fairly close. I will tell you that I did not do the geographical study of the Amalekites and everything that surrounds them and the battles and the Ammonites and things that we're going to see in these 2 chapters. But I will say it's something that I think will be really interesting to see. Other applications will be able to be brought to your mind of how God uses geography, how he uses the different natural things to show his people and others what he's all about and how he operates. Okay? But by way of beginning, I want to look over our objectives tonight. So we're going to look through our Old Testament as where the Amalekites are mentioned, and that's what I mean through Israelite history. I didn't do a whole secondary study on the secular history of the Israelites. I'm just focusing on what the Bible's giving us. And we'll also reflect upon what is lost for David and his men. And then we'll also ask, what is God doing through this event with the Amalekites? Okay, we're going to hone in on them. We're going to see it through God's eyes and what He's doing to them, who He's using against them, and why it's all happening. Okay, and then we'll reflect upon what is and how much is restored. What is and how much is restored. Because this is a theme that I think is contrasted with, you see, as we talked about last week when I titled it, When All Is Lost for Saul, what was his pursuit? We'll hold that thought. And now, when all is lost for David, then where is his pursuit? Okay? So these are our objectives tonight. I'll just leave that up there for you guys to look at. And let's begin now, first, with thinking about the Amalekites. Okay? Just think about them first in Samuel. Okay? Since we've been studying that, where are the Amalekites first introduced to us, and by whom is... well, just tell me what you... Fill in the blanks. Who are the Amalekites? What's God's view of them? Do you remember who first... Oh, go ahead, Jonathan.
Well, they should have been destroyed, right?
Yeah, they should have been destroyed by Saul, who said, I did destroy them. And yet Samuel came and said, you remember that phrase that he said? Well, what is this bleating of the sheep and lowing of the oxen that I hear? And you remember Saul saved Agag, the king of the Amalekites, did not destroy him, along with other spoils. And it's really interesting, it sticks out in my mind. I've heard a sermon on it, and the person presenting the sermon said, I wonder what it would have been like for Agag when he came to Samuel. Because he said, well, surely the battle and all this, he's been imprisoned by the Israelites all this time. Surely all the terrible thing about the war, surely that's over, and the assumption is he'll be released. But do you remember what Samuel did? Hacked him down. I think that's interesting how that's phrased in some versions. He's just hacked down. Okay? And because of that, what was God's response to Saul? Yeah, he took the kingdom away, and there's a phrase in there along that side of the passage that talks about, is God more interested in sacrifice as opposed to obedience? Because he said, I've got all these bulls, goats, rams, etc. We're going to offer these as sacrifice. Like, you're missing the point, Saul. You're trying to get out of obedience. That does not work. Okay? So that is our first taste of the Amalekites in 1 Samuel. But if we were to go back to Numbers, they are people who refuse entrance, in Numbers 14, when Israel refuses to go into the promised land, they're sent into the wilderness to die for 40 years. And they presumed to go anyway upon the place where they were supposed to go to destroy them against, and the Amalekites are mentioned in chapter 14 of Numbers. And so they presumed to go out and do what God commanded them, and they were told, don't go. The Lord is not with you, don't go. But the idea is, well, we've messed up. Well, let's make amends for that mistake, and we're going to go anyway and make this correct. But God says, don't go. And so the Amalekites and the Canaanites joined together and defeated many of the Israelites. Okay? Strike against the Amalekites, because there they are in the wilderness. God describes it as you've taken advantage or over advantage against my people. And then they're mentioned again in Judges. 6 times they're mentioned in Judges. And you'll see this in Judges, in Numbers 2 and in Judges. There's going into the promised land, they're defeating all the people. The goal is to defeat all the people so that they will enter into the promised land because of the wickedness of those people. And God is giving them this land. And so as they go in and they start defeating, they fall off the edge. And there you've got the judges back and forth, spiraling eventually until the point of which everyone does what is right in their own sight. They didn't teach the next generation. And over in this setting of Judges, you have all of these different people that they should be defeating, but are taking from the Israelites. So you remember Gideon and the Midianites who would come at their harvest time, at their planting time is one of the things that are mentioned there. So they're coming out with, just imagine, sacks of seed, and they're going to go plant. And then in come the Midianites, who, interestingly enough, pair up with the Amalekites to take from them. So they're taking their grain before they can plant it for their harvest in the fall. And so they're taking and taking and taking. And this is what's happening over and over and over. Be it the Midianites, though, being the main antagonist, I guess, the supervillain of the story. But the Lord gives his deliverance of Israel, and then we come into 1 Samuel, where the Amalekites are mentioned 11 times, mostly in chapter 15, as you could imagine. All of chapter 15 mentions the Amalekites. And then we're introduced to them again in chapter 30. Okay? So the Amalekites are like the team that cannot be beaten. The armies that are just the thorn in the side of Israel, they were the pitfall persons of Saul. Remember, they were the ones stacked up against him, and he did not destroy them. Okay. Or actually, that was the Philistines. They were there. God just told Saul to go destroy them, and he didn't fully do that. Okay? So let's read now what the Amalekites are doing. Okay? David now is in Ziklag. If you remember few chapters before, we talked about him fleeing from Saul and going to Achish, the king of the Philistines, or a king of the Philistines, within the Philistines. And that's when Saul stopped pursuing David. Okay? Now, when David and his men came to Ziklag on the 3rd day, the Amalekites had made a raid against the Negeb and against Ziklag. They had overcome Ziklag and burned it with fire, and taken captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great. They killed no one, but carried them off and went their way. And when David and his men came to the city, they found it burned with fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep. David's 2 wives also had been taken captive, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David was greatly distressed. For the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. And David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, "Bring me the ephod." So Abiathar brought the ephod to David, and David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I pursue after this band? Shall I overtake them?" He answered him, "Pursue, for you shall surely overtake, and shall surely rescue." So David set out, and the 600 men who were with him, and they came to the brook Besor, where those who were left behind stayed. But David pursued, he and 400 men. 200 stayed behind, who were too exhausted to cross the brook Besor. Now let's stop there. What are you seeing here? What's happening? What do you think about the Amalekites here? Anything odd even being mentioned here? Okay, let me ask this question. What do you think about them taking everyone and not killing anyone? Does that stand out to you? That stood out to me. I thought, what kind of a raid is this? I mean, is this just, hey, I got your basketball, now I'm going to play with it, and you're going to have to get it and come back? What's happening? And I'm not saying I know exactly what's happening. What else do you see here? Yeah, go ahead, Benny.
They could use them as slaves. They could use them in all kinds of ways alive.
Yeah.
That they could work with.
Yeah, they could use them in whatever way they wished, really. Building up their people, like what happens with the Canaanites. When you go into Canaan, you're just absorbed into the Canaanites. When they defeat you, you just become a Canaanite. Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
Tells me that they surrendered without a fight.
Yeah, maybe so. Maybe they surrendered without a fight.
Leave your precious belongings behind without some guard. And the guard, whatever was left behind, did not fight, did not protect the wall, did not do anything. So they just came in, took what they wanted, and committed arson.
Yeah, burn the city.
Because no one stood up to fight against the invader.
Yeah, no one stood up. No one stood up to fight the invader. Maybe it's just they surrendered peacefully, and all their fighting men, the warriors, were gone, as David was previously with all his men up with Achish the king and the other Philistines before the other Philistines said, hey, we don't like David coming with us. He's originally an Israelite, and we're going to go fight up in that area. I don't want to turn around and see him defeating us amongst us. So they sent David back. Yeah, Ben?
I think they were right scared of the Israelites, more of a disrespect. I'm going to take your stuff.
Yeah, maybe so. Maybe it was just a strong arm power move that, I'm bigger than you. What can you do? David, 600 men. We are the Amalekites. And it seems like a kind of a rebound, too, against Saul. Since he came and destroyed quite a bit, while not fully, but now here they've come back against David in Ziklag, which he was a commander, a ruler of. All right, let's bring this kind of a home feeling, okay? A lot of us went out of town this weekend, mainly with our families, I suppose. But the reality is, David and the warriors, so you imagine all the men of the congregation perhaps, we leave to go do something else, and we come back and we see our homes are on fire. They're burning. You see it from afar. You see the smoke rising up. And, if you're whatever animal you're on, or if you're just walking, you're starting to run now. You're sending the fleet feet runners ahead to see what's going on, or maybe they're just going on their own. And you come to the city and all it is burning ash. No people are there. Everyone's gone. All the things of value are gone. Let's read on. Verse 11. After they'd set out, they found an Egyptian in the open country and brought him to David. And they gave him bread, and he ate. They gave him water to drink, and they gave him a cake of figs and 2 clusters of raisins. And when he had eaten, his spirit revived, for he had not eaten bread or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. And David said to him, "To whom do you belong? And where are you from?" He said, "I am a young man of Egypt, servant to an Amalekite, and my master left me behind because I fell sick 3 days ago. We had made a raid against the Negeb of the Cherethites, and against that which belongs to Judah, and against the Negeb of Caleb. and we burn Ziklag with fire. And David said to him, will you take me down to this band? And he said, swear to me by God that you will not kill me or deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will take you down to this band. What do you think? Trap? Here you're with all these men who have wept their eyes out till they can't weep anymore, exhausting themselves. And they set out. And isn't it interesting? One man, you know. I think it was World War II where they have those phrases like loose lips sink ships. And here's one with loose lips. But his life is in his hands. He has no life really to have value of. Anybody could do anything to him. What do you think about his master? In contrast to David here, of who becomes master of his life. He had the power and authority to destroy him. Yeah, go ahead, Ryan.
I think David is showing himself over and over in these last chapters, not only to be the opposite of Saul, but to just exemplify godly character. So I think we first saw that with his pursuit after his people. And we didn't see a burned city and say, oh, we need to go back to our other cities and fortify them more. He said, no, something of mine was lost. I'm going to go get it. Very godly, very Christ-like. And two, here you have a clear contrast between David and the master of this Egyptian. One just denounces, says, you're of no use to me because you're sick. And the other one says, well, no, I'm going to feed you and take care of you, and you're going to help our cause. So if we don't see Christ and all of his works in the Gospels through this, then I think we're missing a big parallel.
Yeah, there's so many parallels. I got me saying parables because I keep thinking there are so many parables that match with this, like you're suggesting. You look at the Gospels, which we have studied multiple times, and if you haven't, please look through those to see these things and the connections that can be made here. But David, over and over, Ryan's saying, is expressing and living out this godly character that cannot be denied, especially in this instance here, where you see one man who's left for dead for 3 days, and David comes and gives him life. And God gives, really, the Amalekites into his hand. Okay? What did David do in this instance in contrast to how Saul would normally approach going to battle? I know you know what it is, but just for repetition's sake, go ahead and identify it. He went to God. It's one of the phrases the ESV uses is then David inquired of the Lord. Okay, we're going to see that when we move into 2 Samuel a few more times. Okay, he inquired of the Lord. I really want to get into some of these applications, but I'm going to wait until we get closer to the end so that we can reflect on those. Okay, what do you think about the Amalekites having an Egyptian slave, or one of the Amalekites having an Egyptian slave? What does that reveal to us about the Amalekites? They're powerful. They've got people from different, or a person from a different region. Maybe they took him from a raid. Maybe they're just so expansive that they just go all over the place, just raid and raid and raid and raid, because it doesn't really sound like they're cultivating their own fields or providing some service to others to make a living. But God decides to reveal them as taking from his people and taking undue advantage of his people over and over. And here we see that they're not only just doing it here, but they see a servant as being sick, and here they have made this great spoil, or they've attained this great spoil of provisions and all these people, and yet, oh, sorry, you're sick. You go that way, and we'll go this way. You see that kind of odd? I mean, it kind of gives you a reflection on this master, at least, of his view of a person's life. And then David here, we're not told of what happened to him, but it seems to suggest that all he needed was some food, some water, somebody to care. But we don't know. He could have died the next day. But it is interesting to consider. Okay, anything else of interest that you see there? Any other contrasts? Oh, go ahead, Ed. Sorry.
Contrast with David and Saul. You know, Saul was being pressured to, Samuel wasn't showing up. He decided to do sacrifice, to take things in his own hands. The people were harping at him. It's great people. Yeah, kind of a situation where David, people were ready to stone him.
Yes.
I mean, he was by himself, basically. The whole group's ready to take it out on him, really. His family, his wives were all taken away, blamed him. The verse where it says, David strengthened himself in the Lord.
Yeah, the second part of verse 6.
So he says, on a different level in the relationship where he was able to count and rely on God's help. That had to be a terrible situation here. Maybe by yourself. What are you going to do? You could easily have pulled a solid trip or something like that. But you didn't,
Yeah, David definitely exemplified a leadership ability that puts him at a level that is uncomparable, so far beyond Saul's. When the people look at him to stone him, and he says he strengthened, or the text says that he strengthened himself in the Lord. How do you do that? How do you strengthen yourself in the Lord? What do you think? Pretty abstract kind of a thought, isn't it? Yeah, go ahead, Adam.
Well, you can borrow from other parts of David's life and some of the Psalms that he's written to think about him pouring out his heart to God and seeking consolation in God, and even looking back on past victories as a symbol of God's faithfulness and using that to steel himself when enemies gather around, even if they're enemies who are part of his own company here.
Yeah, one way is to look in the past, like you're identifying. Look at the Psalms that he wrote, reflecting on his own past even, of how God has been faithful to him. Yeah, perfect. What about the future or the present? Can he strengthen himself in the present, you think? With the Lord? In the Lord? Well, how did he do that? Well, he inquired of him, right? In the present, he inquired of God. What shall I do in this situation? Should I go retrieve my treasures, my heart of all my men and all these people? And isn't that an interesting thought? All of your family is gone as the leaders of these households. Your sons are gone, your daughters are gone. And that's where all these men's, their hearts are just sunken. And David is one of them. And he says, should we go retrieve them? Which I think, well, yeah. Why are you asking? Why, just turn around and go. But that's not what David did. It's almost like, is this the will of God? I don't know what to do, whether I should go or stay, or even if he's even considering that. His first action is inquire of God. What do I do, Lord? Shall I go pursue? And he says, yes, you pursue. And now, as readers of this, we're thinking this is getting to be a very intense action scene coming up here. And now we're taking with us the memory of God's anger against the Amalekites and God's anger even towards Saul. And we're anticipating it all coming to a fruition here, to an intense conclusion. Go ahead, Adam. Sorry.
Yeah, the way you were laying that out about David pausing, it just made me think that you learned the lesson from Nabal and Abigail of just checking with the Lord before trying to pursue his own vengeance, even if he was in the right.
Yeah, great connection. Reflecting back to his pursuit of Nabal and then Abigail stopping him and him coming to his senses in a way of keeping from the blood guilt, how it's phrased there. Excellent thoughts. Yeah. Not without the trial time to grow, David. Yeah, go ahead, Jonathan.
Well, I think it also speaks to like some of the trials you might face as a leader of God's people. I mean, even of God's people, because Moses had a hard time with dealing with Israelites.
Yeah,
David,
Moses had a tough time with the Israelites. That's true.
It's like there's going to be pushback even from your own team sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, same team, guys. It's hard when the mob's against you, yeah. You're right. You're exactly right. That's an excellent observation. Anything else? Okay. Let's look at verse 16 now. 1 Samuel 30:16. And when he had taken him down, behold, they were spread abroad over all the land, eating and drinking and dancing because of all the great spoil they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. And David struck them down from twilight until the evening of the next day. And not a man of them escaped, except 400 young men who mounted camels and fled. Now, I'm going to stop right there. Remember how it was described of the Amalekites, of how they took the people of Ziklag. So not only are these Philistines that are taken, but these are the wives and children and sons of these Israelites. And they're taken, the word the ESV chooses to use is captive. They were, and then in verse, and that's in verse 2, and then in verse, the second part of verse 2, carried them off. Okay, you see that, captive and carried them off. Then they're taken captive again in the first part of verse 5, describing David's wives being taken captive. Okay, I don't want that word choice to be missed by you. Okay. Verse 17, not a man of them escaped except 400 young men who mounted camels and fled. 18, David recovered all that the Amalekites had taken, and David rescued his 2 wives. Nothing was missing, whether small or great, sons or daughters, spoil, or anything that had been taken. David brought back all. David also captured all the flocks and herds, and the people drove the livestock before him and said, "This is David's spoil." Then David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to follow David and who had been left at the brook Besor, and they went out to meet David and to meet the people who were with him. And when David came near to the people, he greeted them. Stop there. Let's reflect now on these last few verses from 11 to 20, or 16 to 20, and think about what we're seeing in this instance. Have we ever read anywhere that in any history that any nation or people or city that was taken captive was restored and nothing was missing? I mean, not in Israel's history. That's when Israel conquered, they took everything. Oftentimes, the people that God had told to be destroyed were killed down to the last animal, right? If all the commandments were obeyed for doing so. But here you've got something really interesting. Has this ever happened before, do you think? Didn't this happen to the nation of Israel? When they were given over to the Assyrians, to Babylon, they were taken into captivity, and then 70 years, and then instead of being absorbed by the Assyrians, instead of being absorbed by the Babylonians, God did something that was unprecedented in all history. He brought them back. And this is exactly what David is doing, isn't it? Nothing is destroyed. And when the enemy thinks that he wins, he is destroyed. And this strong man is bound up and taken and destroyed, and all the spoil is brought back to where it should be. Does that sound like any New Testament kind of concept? New Testament talks about... Oh, go ahead.
I think that there's a very literal connection to being purchased with blood.
Yes.
I mean, these people were not only one, looked after while they were captive, right? I mean, they could have been captive and then killed later, sold off later. So we have one, even when you are in captivity, you're protected by God. And two, he's going to do everything he can to get you back. And in this case, it literally was a repayment. They were ransomed, brought back with the blood of war. And so we can take that and put that in the New Testament so easily, of you being, captured in sin. But the Lord will take care of you then, in the hopes that he's going to always redeem you.
Yeah, there's this redemption of sorts where at least you're... I don't see exactly the one-to-one of the blood necessarily, of being a blood sacrifice, then the people are redeemed necessarily. But I do see for sure the reality that though you're in captivity, you are still cared for by God. Though you're in captivity, there is still someone in the flesh who is going to be around you that can help you. And then I've forgotten some of your other ones, but still good. Sorry if you didn't get them all. But you look at this and you see how Satan can take so much control of this world and can bring people low, can bring people away from what is comfortable, and give you a environment that is just terrible. You are brought away from your provider, away from your protector. And then how else can you see them as a hero unless they, boom, come in and rescue, take back what is theirs, release from captive, rescue, deliver. Okay, David in verse 18 recovered all that the Amalekites had taken. Okay, nothing was missing, small or great, sons or daughters, spoil or anything that had been taken. And that is just unheard of. Okay, they had been gone for 3 days. Nothing's missing, really, nothing at all. They didn't have a caravan that they sent ahead of them to send the spoils to wherever they're from. Okay, really, really interesting. What do you think here? Let's read on in verse 22. Then all the wicked and worthless fellows among the men who had gone with David said, because they did not go with us, we will not give them any of the spoil that we had recovered, except that each man may lead away his wife and children and depart. But David said, you shall not do so, my brothers, with what the Lord has given us. He has preserved us and given into our hand the band that came against us. Who would listen to you in this matter? For as his share is, he who goes down into the battle, so shall his share be who stays by the baggage. They shall share alike. And he made it a statute and a rule for Israel from that day forward to this day. Okay? And then it talks about David's generosity with all of the spoil that he's gotten. He probably sends back spoil from where they, Amalekites, had taken it from. And you see this great deliverer, not only providing the return of those people who were imprisoned, but giving this reparation of those who would be weeping their eyes out, exhausted from weeping. And then not only that, those who are surrounding the sorrow of being taken advantage of by the Amalekites during their raids, things being restored, things brought to life by this new King David. Okay, very quickly. Let's review, let's summarize what happened to Saul. Remember, David said, I'm not going to kill Saul. He might die in battle, and in fact, he does. He is found by the archers. And he tells his armor bearer to kill him, for he is finished. And he wouldn't kill the Lord's anointed. Good on him. Saul falls on his own sword so that he would not be put to shame by the Philistines. And yet, they still cut off his head, take him, Jonathan, and pin them on the wall. Taken back with the Philistines to pin them, demonstrate, we've got the power. We've got your king. He's dead. Here he is on display. And then those men of Jabesh Gilead go in and give him a proper burial. I think that's really interesting. Those that would be the valiant men go with this extreme loyalty, at the cost of their own lives, to take a dead body and bring it back. Okay, with our last few minutes, I'd like to look at some of these things as application. Something that Jonathan was mentioning was really intriguing to me from this text as well. What does this teach us about followers in sorrow and distress? What does it teach us?
We should strengthen ourselves in the Lord.
That's exactly what the leaders does in sorrow and distress. And this is exactly what the followers should be following. But you see what happens when we get into sorrow and distress, we go crazy. We want to stone the leader who has brought us this far, right? Have you ever seen that before? It seems like you get into a situation and they perhaps, whatever the reason, it's bad. Well, the leader should have thought of this. They should have thought ahead to mitigate this risk. Why didn't we leave someone behind to protect the city? Why did we wait and not build up the walls higher? It is what it is in this circumstance. But the wrong response is to say off with his head to the leader when things are hard. Okay? You ought to sit and wait for the leader to go inquire of the Lord. Okay? Maybe we ought to encourage our leaders to inquire of the Lord when we're facing hard and distressing situations and sorrow upon sorrow. Okay? God in this time of sorrow and distress. What does this teach us about God in this time of sorrow and distress? Okay? One, He will let us have sorrow and distress. Why do you think that is? This was not David's fault. It was not the men's fault. There was nothing they did that was their fault. In fact, we might even go ahead and go backwards and blame Saul. This was the fault of this sinful king who did not know what it meant to obey God. But they didn't do that. They trusted David eventually with him inquiring of the Lord, and they went after in pursuit of what God had commanded them to do. So God will let us have sorrow and distress, which I would suggest is for the purpose of drawing nearer to Him. And in time, He'll let you work it out to retrieve everything back. I can't imagine what the sorrow and distress would have been like for Job. On one day, multiple people coming and telling you all this is gone, all this is gone, your sons, your daughters, they're gone. What do you think about your father now? God, the deliverer and provider of everything, why is all this happening to me? Well, it's to demonstrate sometimes life just happens to allow you to show God, or to show that God is your number one. And I would suggest it's to show you that you have God as your number one. And sometimes that's the experience we need to help us build our faith. Thank you so much tonight for your kind attention, your great thoughts.